Whether Russia and China will quarrel over DPRK troops, whether there will be a tough NATO response to such cooperation, and what kind of treaty Russia is going to sign with Iran, we'll talk about more than that right now with Israeli military analyst David Sharp. David, hello. Thank you, Anastasia. Good evening. Words of support are always very important. I never tire of saying that. Everyone watching us live or later in the recording, please give us a like, leave a comment with your country and city, and ask your questions. A partnership treaty between Russia and Iran will be signed in the near future, Foreign Minister Lavrov said, adding that the treaty will confirm the parties' desire for closer cooperation in the defense field. An interaction for peace and security at the regional and global levels. David, what is the threat in such cooperation and in such treaties to both Ukraine and Israel? The threat is significant. Each listed country poses a particular danger, with Russia being the main, but unfortunately not the only enemy of Ukraine. For Israel, Iran is a paramount threat. Certainly, Russian aid, various kinds of aid and cooperation between Russia and various pro-Iranian forces, or not pro-Iranian, but hostile to Israel, pose a very serious threat to Israel. In general, an interesting point, this treaty between Russia and Iran, we don't know, of course, many of its points, except that a treaty is a treaty. But very often things happen, and there have been conversations for quite some time. It seems like it should have been signed a long time ago, but it was delayed. In my opinion, it demonstrates the difference that there is in the relationship between Russia and Iran and Russia and North Korea. Iran is a very specific country with significant ambitions in many different places, including on the globe. First of all, this is the Middle East region, but not only. In some issues, Russia and Iran are, let's say, not exactly allies. They have some overlapping interests. And even in Syria, especially before the big war in Ukraine, Russia and Iran did not look at everything through the same prism. That is, there were, and in general probably still are, situations there that can be called controversial. In particular, this is an attempt to extract from Syria, which both countries have largely saved. I don't mean Syria, but the Assad regime. So maximizing the benefits of your presence in Syria sometimes means getting those benefits at the expense of someone else, at the expense of your partner and situational ally. Nevertheless, the main thing that may be of interest to both Ukraine and Israel, in this case, not only Ukraine and Israel, but also many other countries may face significant threats from Russia and Iran, even if they are not directly involved in hostilities. This cooperation poses a broader threat, highlighted by reports of Russia considering transferring anti-ship missiles to the Houthis. People are killed almost every day by Iranian munitions, or homes are destroyed in Ukraine. In contrast, Iran is getting something that it has been lacking, and what it has been missing, it may even be fairly innocent things. But if Iran is getting innocent things, it's down to food and money. And if Iran gets extra money and food, that means it can bring in more resources to build missiles and so on. Unfortunately, it's not just about innocent things.
И наоборот, Иран получает что-то, чему ему не доставало. И чего ему не доставало, это могут быть даже довольно невинные вещи. Но если Иран, невинные вещи, это вплоть до продовольствия и денег. Но если Иран получает дополнительные деньги и продовольствие, значит он может привлечь больше ресурсов для строительства ракет и так далее. Но, к сожалению, речь идет не только о невинных вещах,
Iranians get what they lack militarily from each other. Each lacks something, and it literally leads to bloodshed in very different faraway places. And of course, this cannot but be worrying. I very much hope that the relevant intelligence services of different countries are monitoring this cooperation very carefully, and accordingly, this allows to a certain extent, well, let's say, not to a full extent, but to prepare an antidote to this cooperation. You say that this is a slightly different kind of cooperation than Russia's cooperation with North Korea. That is, there is no threat of that. That Iran will provide not only weapons and shaheda, but also its military, for example. Yes, about the same. That's exactly what I meant. North Korea is a country with a completely grotesque regime, and I would say that literally the country is owned, sort of owned, by a specific person who can do almost anything he wants with his subjects, including renting them out. Tragic rent, for lack of another term, to fight. And we're not talking about a few military advisors, instructors, specialists, but about having them fight Ukrainians on the other side of the world. Iran has its own disadvantages and peculiarities, and it's unlikely to send thousands of soldiers to Russia to fight in Ukraine, though it may send officers to gain experience or weapons operators. Such a thing was reported, by the way, just go figure if it happened. But such a North Korean scenario in the Russian-Ukrainian war, of course, does not happen in life. I can, knowing Iranian specifics, imagine it quite well. Or rather, I can't even imagine it. And by the way, regarding the North Korean soldiers are preparing up to 12,000 kimchi on Ina, among them 500 officers and 3 generals of the General Staff of the DPRK. This was stated by the post-representative of Ukraine to the UN, Serhiy Kislitsa, and he noted that Russia now intends to form 5 units from North Korean soldiers. They will be given uniforms, weapons, fake documents, and integrated into a special Buryat battalion. David, why are they hiding them and turning them into Buryats? Also, how much could the 3,000 allegedly in Khershchina change the battlefield situation if they enter today or tomorrow? Regarding forged documents and attempts to implement in Buryat or other battalions and formations, say, although officially there are no Buryat units and formations in Russia, this raises big questions for me. Frankly, I would be surprised if it was done so, because it is impossible to hide forged documents. Yes, what can all this be done for? First of all, North Koreans, let's say, look like representatives of some Asian nations, people who are citizens of Russia. You can say that there is some reason, but if we are talking about captivity, you can only give fake documents for this purpose. For what purpose? For them to present them inside Russia or on Russian-occupied territory to the local Russian authorities? But it's not serious. So in case of being captured, naturally, no one can pretend to be a Buryat, whether they have forged documents or not. I see no sense in this action. Regardless of their status as allied forces, it's impossible to hide a North Korean who doesn't speak Russian and lacks a credible backstory if captured. If he is not in captivity, then these kinds of measures also make no sense and are in fact ridiculous. Now for the military aspects, 12,000. Actually, if this figure is final and we are more and more convinced that something like this is true, it is quite a lot, I must say. So it could be roughly that on the scale of the whole front, it's not that many, apparently. The Russian grouping, if we are talking about the front line, in depth, including auxiliary units, and so on, On the Russian territory close to Ukraine, it is generally considered to be 500 to 600,000 people. So within the framework, we take a percentage of such a grouping. 12,000 is only 2%. It's not much, but I guess in the global sense of the word, the Koreans, I take it, are more combat. It's not logistics. That's where their percentage goes up, if we're talking about 12,000. I don't think they're going to be thrown into battle all at once. But if several thousand are thrown into battle and the rest serve as a reserve and auxiliary forces, it is a lot for some serious localized section of the front. And the fate of the war is decided, as they call it, in localized areas on a cumulative basis. So when we talk, and not only talk, Ukrainian fighters are fighting, and we talk about events on certain parts of the front. Offensive actions. Very often, these offensive actions are conducted by Russia on a permanent basis, but with small forces. So it's not that several thousand people attacked at one time. It's nothing like that. It's many times a few to a few dozen people attacking at one time. If we are talking about numbers, accordingly, the number of several thousand people on one fairly extensive section of the front is who is holding that section. The one who is advancing on this section means, if it turns out that the Koreans are not badly prepared and motivated. Motivation is ideological processing. It's hard for me to judge. Maybe it's material incentives, maybe it's ideological processing. We don't know anything about it. If they turn out to be, in some ways, much more capable than the average Russian military, because there are a lot of Russian military personnel who are drawn into service. By the way, in terms of numbers, just for comparison, the data says that give or take 30,000 people, 25,000 to 30,000 people, Russia manages to attract per month for, well, you could say for material reasons. So it turns out that Koreans are somewhere around the 2-week norm, if we proceed from such data. Those who are attracted to Russia are usually poorly prepared and have been preparing for weeks. So the Koreans, I assume, who are sent, there's talk of some special forces, are those who are supposed to be prepared in some way, but by Korean standards. It's unlikely that they're sending those who don't have the slightest clue. Another thing is that they have no combat experience. And maybe they were preparing for old wars, not for wars where everything is swarming with drones, air defense drones, and so on. But we have to assume worst-case scenarios that, at least individually, we are talking about fighters trained above the Russian average. About the fact that, go figure, how they are ideologically pumped up, maybe it's not so bad. The fact that they are for a localized area is certainly not insignificant. But in a global sense, if we compare it to the scale of the entire front, these are still certainly not numbers that change the outcome of events. What is interesting here is that the DPRK sent 3 more generals. One of them is the Deputy Chief of General Staff of North Korea. What can they do? How will they manage their troops? Will they be here long-term or just for a few weeks? The relationship between North Korea and Russia isn't a secret, but there's much we don't know. Given that a large contingent is being sent, it's unclear how they will be organized, whether as part of a division or brigades. How will it be replenished? Will a few thousand be at the front while the rest train and wait? Or will they deploy all at once, 8, 9, or 10,000 people? It's likely that a large contingent will operate together, rather than being spread across Russian units. They may operate in their own sector of the front or perform rear functions, but under their own command. It's unlikely that Koreans would be placed under the command of a Russian major or lieutenant colonel. That would be inappropriate. I assume they will be led by Korean officers, possibly a high-ranking officer like the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, who may directly command this contingent or oversee coordination with Russia.
командовать высокопоставленный офицер, замначальника генштаба, может быть, будет непосредственно осуществлять вообще командование этим контингентом.
In other words, missions will come down from the Russian command, and their acceptability will be decided, apparently, at some level of discussion. So the Koreans will apparently act under their own command, and at a higher level there will be a certain, or rather not certain, coordination of mission distribution.
Так что действовать корейцы будут под своим, видимо, командованием, а вот на переводчике и на более верхнем уровне будет определенное, вернее, неопределенное, будет...
That's how I see it. But here we are guessing at the coffee grounds. We don't really understand what the Russian commanders are deciding, what they think. And could China have an influence on this whole situation? After all, the Financial Times previously wrote that even before North Korean troops were sent to the Russian Federation, Chinese President Xi Jinping was dissatisfied with this strengthening of cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang. Beijing is concerned that deepening ties between Russia and North Korea could destabilize the Korean peninsula, but strengthen U.S.-led alliances in the region.
Оказать давление на КНДР, чтобы она вернула войска из Российской Федерации, сообщает CNN. А может ли на всю эту ситуацию повлиять Китай? Ведь ранее Financial Times писали о том, что еще до отправки северокорейских войск в Российскую Федерацию глава Китая Си Цзиньпинь был недоволен этим укреплением сотрудничества между Москвой и Пхеньяном. И в Пекине обеспокоены тем, что углубление связи России и Северной Кореи может дестабилизировать Корейский полуостров, ну и укрепить альянсы под руководством США в регионе.
China is almost the only country, although today Russia too, that has significant leverage over North Korea. However, the assumption or postulate that North Korea is a complete puppet of China, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, is wrong. That is, China can very seriously influence what happens inside North Korea.
То есть Китай может и очень серьезно повлиять на то, что происходит внутри Северной Кореи. Основная торговля между...
The main trade between North Korea and the outside world is through China. Moreover, China is a major trading partner. It can actually block the North Korean border. So if there was a will, China can influence North Korea very much, and it does influence some things. However, the question is what that desire is. China has its own interests, its own maneuvering capabilities, including this relationship between China and Russia and North Korea. Therefore, the Americans can appeal to China all they want. It would be better and more effective if the Americans offered China some pluses or minuses for China to push North Korea with the corresponding result. That is, if there is a result, China might even get some preferential treatment. On the contrary, if it does not push, if it is not active, China will also pay for it, so that it will be motivated to push North Korea. But this is general speculation. China has its own interests, and as it is commonly believed, China's common interest is for Russia to lose the war, for the West to spend its resources on helping Ukraine and forget about China. At that time, Russia itself would be more dependent on China. Politically and economically, as Russia is forced to sell raw materials to China cheaply. On the contrary, China sells a lot of essentials to Russia. In general, there are many different kinds of benefits, and specifically in relations with the DPRK. What is there to say? There are many nuances here, and even experts in this field, of course, only guess what is really going on between Pyongyang and Beijing. But it seems that China has no particular grounds for discontent. It may even be quite dissatisfied, but we have yet to see any decisive steps. But China has the means to put pressure on North Korea. Whether it wants to use them is a huge question. And so far I see no reason for the Chinese to use them. And can this cooperation between Russia and North Korea essentially quarrel Russia and China? After all, we know that China has influence not only on the DPRK but also on Russia. For this cooperation to quarrel Russia with China, China must perceive it not just as an insult, but as a serious threat to its interests. In this case, I don't see, and even if China feels a certain discomfort about it, I don't see on the face of it that China sees it literally as a serious threat. If China perceived a threat or problem, it would inform North Korea and Russia. If China made serious claims against Russia, I believe North Korea would consider those claims, as China is Russia's key partner politically, economically, and semi-militarily. Russia's military-industrial complex and economy rely heavily on trade with China for necessary components. For North Korea, its current relationship with Russia is like a jackpot, a lifeline that provides access to resources and political cover from the Security Council.
Отношения с Россией нынешние, это я называю это джекпотом или лотерейным билетом, потому что, это просто как даже соломинка, а спасательный круг.
Nevertheless, China is more significant for North Korea. If China were to present something in ultimatum form to Russia or North Korea, there would be a result. But as far as we can see, there's nothing like that. Not presented in ultimatum form, not apparently hurting China's interests at that deep level, even though China may be unhappy about something. President Zelensky says the world is weakly responding to North Korean troops in Russia, marking a new chapter in the war. Everyone is afraid of escalation again, but at the same time, they are letting Putin know that he's allowed to go on and on. David, what do you think is preventing our partners, the United States and NATO countries, from cooperating right now? We heard yesterday that Austin, the head of the Pentagon, talked about the readiness to use nuclear weapons if South Korea is threatened. The threat of South Korea is a completely different story because there is a long and close relationship between the United States and South Korea, which can be called absolutely allied, where the Americans guarantee, including by force, the defense of South Korea. South Korea has quite strong armed forces, although all this goes back to the 50s.
Все это уходит корнями в 50-е годы и в любом случае подразумевается в случае угрозы Южной Кореи со стороны.
In any case, the implication is that if South Korea is threatened by North Korea or China, as it was in the 50s, there will be direct intervention by the United States. However, there is one important but. North Korea, although it is South Korea's adversary and makes sometimes bellicose statements backed by nuclear weapons tests, there has been no war between the two countries since 1953. If the current leader of North Korea continues in this vein, attacking South Korea, which itself is stronger and has an ally in the United States, would be insane. Preparing for war, yes. Rhetoric, yes. But a crazy attack doesn't fit reality.
Сама по себе сильнее северная, да еще имеет союзником в лице Соединенных Штатов, было бы безумие. То есть подготовка к войне, да, риторика, да, но вот безумное нападение ни в какие ворота не вписывается.
Thus, we conclude that the West and Ukraine's partners cannot do anything special against North Korea. Unfortunately, it must be stated that the West is following the strategy of not escalating with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Expecting the use of military force against North Korea would be absolutely, I would say, beyond fantasy.
Ждать применения военной силы против Северной Кореи было бы абсолютно, я бы сказал, это за гранью фантастики.
If we do not use military force against North Korea, we are left with economic sanctions and public statements. However, as we understand, they are of little use. The economic sanctions are not very good because, first, North Koreans live in such a way that there is no mass trade with them, and cutting all ties once will not change anything. Secondly, Russia and China are not joining these sanctions. It will be impossible to pass them through the Security Council. In addition, it is important to realize that this sanctions tool, even theoretically, is rather weak because of the endurance of North Korea and because it is not customary to starve the population of countries nowadays. Sanctions may affect the economy, but to lead to, say, starvation or a humanitarian catastrophe due to a lack of medicines is considered unacceptable these days.
Население стран подсанкционных. Можно воздействовать на экономику, но вот привести, скажем, к какому-нибудь голоду или чего-то подобного, или
Even this approach would hardly be possible as long as North Korea is bordered by China and Russia, which do not join the sanctions. Thus, it is difficult to do anything within the current paradigms. Nevertheless, the West, as I see it, is obliged to take some action after a single North Korean soldier enters Ukrainian soil or simply starts fighting Ukrainians.
северокорейский солдат вступит на украинскую землю или просто вступит в бой с украинцами, какие-то практического характера меры просто обязаны предпринять.
I call it minimal retaliation, so that the North Koreans at least pay something for this cooperation in terms of economics. In addition, there would be a desire to take action against Russia because it accepts aid from Iran and North Korea. Russia could be made to pay for receiving this aid. There are many economic sanctions on Russia that could be deepened. But here, the West has its own strategies, which imply different approaches, including the unwillingness to escalate and worsen the economic situation inside their countries. If they stop trading with Russia in one direction or another, there will be consequences. But the important thing I want to emphasize is that there should be some real retribution for what is happening or has already happened. These measures should affect both the DPRK and Russia. But in the current situation, I'm not optimistic about.
Впрочем, в рамках нынешних, то, что в нынешней ситуации, я не испытываю оптимизма насчет
that something effective and substantial can be done or will be done.
предпринять или захотят предпринять.
The Center for Countering Disinformation reports that Russian troops have started transferring engineering units from North Korea to occupied Ukrainian territories, particularly Donetsk. As Biden stated, this is no longer just Russian territory. It's a legitimate military target, and we will address it as we do with the Russians. If we talk about the current situation on the front, we see that unfortunately the Russians have an advance in Damas, in particular in the Kurakhov direction. David, what do you think is the reason for this rapid advance of the occupiers? And what is the main problem? There are many different options, and I would like to hear your opinion. As always, there is a whole set of problems. The main problems are objective in nature, but even these objective problems have subjective components. There are many problems, and one can go backwards quite far. First, the first obvious one. Ukraine needs more ammunition of certain types, more barrels. I am primitivizing now, more equipment, more aid, and more intensive assistance from the West. If things had gone as they should have, the situation would be better. Moreover, here we are. Why I say we are leaving, we can look in retrospect. That long break in receiving American aid played a negative role. When the aid package was passed in Congress, it was not there, they were saving ammunition, and so on. The problems that were aggravated then are still evident now. That is, there were heavy losses there at that time. Then certain, let's say, miscalculations were made and the situation worsened. Let's define it this way. Just because the situation worsened doesn't mean it was fixable once the guns started firing again. A major issue is the personnel shortage, which affects the Russian army's numerical advantage. Timely mobilization could have minimized this problem. The Ukrainian military acknowledges personnel challenges, discussing the formation of new units with inexperienced fighters and commanders, which are insufficiently equipped to handle serious combat tasks during an enemy offensive.
Мобилизационного характера, этот фактор был бы менее значимым, а может быть вообще не был значимым. Конечно же, есть и проблемы с комплектацией, об этом говорят украинские военные. дискуссия, создавать новые части, состоящие из неопытных бойцов.
First of all, it is necessary to replenish old experienced brigades, where the backbone of experienced fighters and commanders makes it possible to quickly train new recruits and increase the motivation of those who do not have this motivation. In general, there are measures that could have been taken in time. However, even today, the necessary steps in the right direction can correct the situation. Maybe not even tomorrow, but they can improve it in the medium and short term. So, on the one hand, there is an objective shortage of manpower, and on the other hand, there are some measures that need to be taken. There's a lot to talk about. Of course, there are mistakes on the battlefield. Far from being the nature of war, mistakes are made in all armies. We are talking about the offensive in the Kursk region, which achieved certain results, both military and media. However, it was a very difficult choice. It was made consciously. A significant part of the resources went to Kursk region and are still directed to this direction in order to repel Russian attacks, and these forces are not sufficient in other directions. On the other hand, let's say that these forces would not operate in Kursk, but would operate somewhere near Pokrovskoye. But the Russian army forces that are involved near Kursk would also be near Pokrovskoye. So it's also impossible to say 100% that it would have been better or much better. In general, there are a lot of reasons of different nature, and if this trend cannot be stopped by reserves or by exhausting the Russian army, we will see a further advance of the Russian army. In the coming days and weeks, Kurakovo is the main point of application.
Не удастся остановить, то мы будем наблюдать дальнейшее продвижение российской армии. Ну а в ближайшие дни и недели Курахово — это вот такой вот основная точка приложений.
They seek to capture this key locality in terms of logistics and in general for the defense of southern Donbass. All efforts will be directed towards this.
И все усилия будут на это направлены.
David, thank you for this conversation and for joining our broadcast. I wish you a pleasant evening. Remember, we have David Sharp with us. Friends, please support this discussion with likes, leave comments, and share this video with your friends. Thank you all for your attention. Good news. Take care and see you soon. Thank you, Anastasia. I join you in wishing you good news and all the best.
Присоединяюсь, пожелания хороших новостей и всего самого наилучшего.